Yeah.
The meeting will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee, not on this subcommittee, are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing is entitled Examining Private Market Exemptions as a Barrier to IPOs and Retail Investment. I now recognize myself for 3.5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today, we are examining one of the most important developments in the markets in the past 20 years, the explosive and frankly troubling growth of the private markets. Companies are staying private longer and are raising more money in the private markets than ever before. And all of this is coming at the expense of the public markets, which is historically where retail investors have the greatest opportunities and where all investors have the greatest protections. The private markets used to be much smaller than the public markets for decades. The private markets were about half the size of the public markets. But over the past 20 years, the private markets have grown and now are more than twice the size of the public markets. Some commentators have argued that the solution to this is to allow retail investors to invest in private securities, to take advantage of the supposed high-growth investment opportunities in the private markets. But are there truly better investments opportunities in the private markets, or do they just seem better because of opaque financial reporting and loose valuation practices? These are some of the questions that we're going to examine today. It's not a secret why private markets have grown so large. Both Congress and the SEC have slowly relaxed the rules around private markets for decades, allowing more and more investors to participate in private securities offerings, with fewer and fewer restrictions on private companies. We also need to look at whether Congress and the SEC have gone too far in deregulating private markets, and whether it's time to reverse course on this deregulation. In addition, we will consider several pieces of legislation in this hearing, including a bill to tighten the rules for the most common type of private security, and a bill to make the SEC consider the impact of its deregulatory rulemaking on public and private markets. Mr. Vargas also has a bill that is designed to attract more investment into rare disease therapies, which have historically struggled to attract capital, even though successfully curing even a single rare disease could save thousands of lives. Finally, we will consider several bills that make technical changes, including a bill that I've introduced to fix an unintended problem that has come up for family offices, and a bill by the ranking member to codify the SEC no-action letter that addresses certain M&A brokers. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel of witnesses on all of these issues, and with that, I now recognize the ranking member for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thanks, Chairwoman Maloney. I appreciate you holding this bipartisan hearing on our legislative proposals that are designed to reduce regulatory barriers to capital formation and increase investment opportunities for American workers and Main Street investors. Over the years, I've been increasingly discussing and focused on the declining number of public companies, which has led to fewer investment opportunities for Main Street investors. As we all know, IPOs have historically been one of the most meaningful steps in the life cycle of a company. Going public not only affords companies many benefits, including access to public capital markets, but IPOs are important to the investing public. There's no question that the U.S. IPO market has steadily decreased at an alarming rate, while the regulatory compliance cost for business has continued to grow exponentially. All the while, foreign markets such as China continue to grow, and in 2017 alone, those foreign markets produced over 1/3 of the world's IPOs. Our capital markets have been widely recognized for being the deepest, most liquid, and most competitive markets in the world, but it is clearly evident that there is much room for improvement. Today, we're examining 5 bipartisan proposals that will reduce barriers to investment and strengthen public markets while maintaining the appropriate balance between capital formation and investor protection. I'm very pleased that one of the bills being discussed today is my bipartisan legislation, H.R. 609, the Small Business Mergers, Acquisitions, Sales, and Brokerage Simplification Act. This very important bill would simplify the registration system for brokers known as mergers and acquisitions, or M&A, brokers that perform services in connection with the transfer of ownership of smaller, privately held companies. M&A brokers provide a variety of services such as educating business owners on the selling process, preparing a business for sale, analyzing company financials, identifying the market and potential buyers, and coordinating with lawyers, accountants, and other consultants. These business brokerage services are critically important to entrepreneurs who start, build, and eventually want to sell their private enterprises. Similarly, these services help new entrepreneurs acquire businesses while helping existing companies grow, thus preserving and creating jobs in the communities that we all serve. H.R. 609 provides much-needed relief for these M&A brokers. In fact, this small business initiative promotes economic growth and development through business sales, creation, preservation, and provides important, immediate, and substantial relief of regulatory burdens on small business professionals who serve these small business owners. The SEC has provided a similar no-action relief to exempt M&A brokers from registration requirements, but a statutory exemption is not necessary in order to provide business certainty, a statutory exemption is necessary in order to provide business certainty and avoid legal risks that can be harmful to these small business owners. As we all know, SEC no-action letters can be modified or withdrawn at any time. It's important to note that this very bill passed the House of Representatives in the 115th Congress by a vote of 426 to 0. This bill was also included in the Bipartisan Jobs and Investor Confidence Act, and that passed the House by a vote of 406 to 4. So I'm pleased that we're considering other pro-growth bipartisan bills, such as the Family Technical Correction Act, offered by the chairwoman, Main Street Growth Act, offered by Mr. Emmer, Crowdfunding Amendments Act, offered by Ranking Member McHenry, and the Fair Investment Opportunities for Professional Experts Act, offered by Representative Hill. So we as lawmakers should be working to create an atmosphere that helps promote more capital formation and to allow the free flow of capital, strengthen job creation, and increase economic growth. These 5 bipartisan proposals will help promote those economic opportunities, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the full committee, Mrs. Waters, for 1.5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'd like to thank Chair Maloney for holding this hearing on an important and growing part of our financial system, the private securities markets. In 2000, private assets under management totaled less than $1 trillion. That figure has since skyrocketed to over $5 trillion today, and recent research has indicated that private markets are growing at more than twice the rate of their public counterparts. This enormous shift from public to private markets will undoubtedly have a wide range of impacts on all types of investors across America. I'm particularly interested in hearing more about the effects of the increasingly favorable regulatory environment for private markets, the impact that it is having on and when and whether companies decide to go public, and what this means for our investors. So I thank the witnesses for appearing before us today and look forward to their testimonies. I yield back.
Thank you. Today we welcome the testimony of a distinguished panel of witnesses. First, we have Dr. Renee Jones, who is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a Professor of Law at Boston College Law School. Second, we have Dr. Elizabeth DeFontenay, who is a Professor of Law at Duke University School of Law. Next, we have Mike Pichik, who is the Vermont Commissioner of Financial Regulation and is the President of the North American Securities Administrators Association. And next, we have Dr. Andrew Lowe, who is a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Last but not least, we have Douglas Elinoff, who is a partner at the law firm of Elinoff, Grossman & Scholl in New York. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. Without objection, your testimony will be made part of the record. Dr. Jones, you are now recognized for 5 minutes, and thank you.
Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Huizinga, and members of the subcommittee. Good morning to Chairman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry. My name is Renee Jones, and I'm a professor of law and the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Boston College Law School, where my research focuses on corporate law, securities law, and corporate governance. In my testimony today, I will focus on the risks that the growing number of large private companies poses for investors, employees, consumers, and society. My testimony will connect recent changes in the securities laws to the explosive growth in private financing markets and the contraction of public equity markets. I will highlight some of the unintended consequences that flow from fostering growth of highly capitalized private companies, also known as unicorns, with little information available to investors and the public about their performance and their operations. The size of public equity markets in the United States is shrinking. There are only half as many public companies today as there were 10 years ago. The number of public offerings each year is also significantly lower than in the past. At the same time, the amount of capital raised in private transactions is surging. Last year, there was more than twice as much capital was raised in private markets than through public offerings. The growth of private markets and the shrinking of public markets is not an inexplicable phenomenon. Instead, these trends correspond in time with changes to the securities laws introduced by Congress and the SEC over the past 15 years. The most important of these changes include easing standards for resale of securities under Rule 144, which helped foster the creation of private trading markets for startup company shares, eliminating the ban on general solicitation for Rule 506 transactions that are limited to accredited investors, and increasing the number of shareholders that compels registration from 500 to 2,000, excluding from that count employee-held shares and crowdfunding shares. Taken together, these changes have made it easier for companies to raise funds in private offerings while facilitating the ability of startup investors and employees to liquidate their shares. These reforms have eased internal and external pressures that once drove startup companies to pursue IPOs. These changes in the law have contributed to the emergence of unicorns, once rare but increasingly common private companies with a valuation of $1 billion or more. There are now reportedly 400 unicorns worldwide with an estimated valuation of $1.2 trillion. This growing number of unicorns has introduced new risks that existing corporate governance structures cannot adequately address. Until recently, startups and their founders were subject to tight controls that were exerted by the managers of the venture capital funds that financed them. Beginning around 2010, the tables turned and startup founders have begun to gain the upper hand. As venture capitalists competed for access to deals, they began to offer financing on founder-friendly terms. In the founder-friendly model, founders receive shares with super voting power, typically 10 votes per share. This enables the founders to maintain control over the board despite having a relatively small financial stake in the firm. So this era of founder control has created an environment at unicorns that is ripe for management abuse. The absence of board oversight created the backdrop for dramatic scandals at Uber, Theranos, and other unicorn firms. Unicorn governance poses clear risks to investors, but the structure can also harm employees who often have significant investments in the form of employee shares. Consumers and society could also suffer when unicorns engage in illegal conduct or otherwise seek to skirt existing laws. To address the many shortcomings in unicorn governance structures, Congress should consider a number of reforms. Dual-class capitalization has become a standard feature of many startup companies, and the structure has been carried through in unicorn IPOs. Congress should direct the SEC to study the implications of this trend. The most effective way for Congress to shore up shrinking public markets is to reverse the recent amendments to Section 12G of the 1934 Act. As it now stands, Section 12G allows unicorns to delay an IPO indefinitely, allowing these important companies to operate in secrecy, shrouded from public scrutiny and accountability. Thank you.
Dr. Fontenay, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Huizenga, members of the subcommittee, Chairwoman Waters, and Ranking Member McHenry, thank you for inviting me to testify at this hearing. The U.S. capital markets are at a crossroads. In the public securities markets, with the notable exception of the dot-com bubble, the number of public companies and the rate of IPOs have been declining overall since the 1980s. Meanwhile, the private securities markets have grown exponentially. The concurrence of these two developments is no accident. Over the last few decades, Congress and the SEC have substantially deregulated private capital, for example, allowing firms to raise unlimited amounts of capital from institutional and high net worth investors with no material public disclosure obligations whatsoever. Among other things, this allows many U.S. firms to remain private indefinitely. On the heels of this deregulatory wave, the principal restriction on private capital raising that remains is the general prohibition on selling private securities to retail investors. For the most part, retail investors are confined to the public securities markets, a foundational principle of the federal securities laws since their Depression-era origins. Today, even this principle is being called into question. The SEC's concept release and certain of the bills being considered today include proposals that would allow small-dollar retail investors to invest directly in private securities. Proposals to usher retail investors into the private markets espouse two laudable goals: remedying a perceived inequality of opportunity for retail investors and encouraging efficient capital raising. It is my view, however, that these proposals fail on both counts and would in fact exacerbate the very problems they purport to address. The notion that retail investors are missing out on the opportunity to invest in private securities is based on faith rather than data. The available research suggests that they would do materially worse in the private markets than in the public markets for a host of reasons. While the public markets were specifically designed to create an even playing field for retail investors, the private markets give every advantage to insiders and to institutional investors with more bargaining power, sophistication, and access to information. Nor would direct retail investment in the private markets be good for capital allocation. Given the current glut of capital in the markets, firms that still cannot attract capital from institutional investors are the smallest firms with the very worst prospects. Retail investors' dreams of investing early in the next Google are no more than that. There is considerable room for disagreement over whether public companies and the public markets are subject to too much regulation. The same cannot be said for whether increasing retail investor presence in the private markets would be good for investors or good for capital allocation. The fact that we have finally achieved some success in steering retail investors' retirement money to low-cost index funds should rightly be considered one of the crowning achievements of the last decade in investor protection. That we would choose this moment to encourage retail investors to pursue undiversified, high-risk investments with poor return prospects seems puzzling, to say the least. This is particularly true when serious warning signs point toward overheating in the private markets, where complaints of too much money chasing too few good ideas have become a constant refrain. If Congress and the SEC are concerned about shrinking investment opportunities for retail investors, the solution lies not in throwing retail investors to the wolves in the private markets, but rather in ensuring a healthy pipeline of companies going and remaining public. This may require reversing course on Congress's approach in the Jobs Act of allowing companies to remain private indefinitely, despite multi-billion-dollar valuations and widely dispersed share ownership. Without question, the private markets play a significant and important role in financing U.S. businesses. Yet exemptions from securities registration do not come for free. By drawing issuers and capital away from the public markets, they substantially reduce the liquidity, price discovery, and information quality that have made the U.S. capital markets the envy of the world for over 80 years. Rather than blindly continuing to expand exemptions from securities registration, we should pause to ask whether doing so undermines the public markets that have served retail and institutional investors so well. Thank you.
Mr. Pichak, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Huizenga, Chairwoman Waters, and Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Mike Pichak, and I'm the Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation, which regulates Vermont's insurance, captive insurance, banking, and securities industries. And as of yesterday, I am also the immediate past president of the North American Securities Administrators Association, known as NASA. I have chaired NASA's corporate finance section and currently serve as NASA's representative to the SEC Small Business Capital Formation Committee. I previously practiced law as an associate at Skadden Arps, largely working on public company mergers and acquisitions. NASA is comprised of state securities regulators who serve on the front lines of investor protection, helping to safeguard the financial futures of hardworking Americans and assisting local businesses in raising capital to start or grow their operation. State security regulators take seriously the important role that we play with our federal counterparts and policymakers to ensure that our capital markets remain the envy of the financial world. To do this, we all must be thoughtful in balancing two seemingly competing interests, the interests of investor protection and the interests of capital formation. Investor protection is always at the forefront of NASA's mind. However, we recognize that standards which are too stringent in an effort to protect investors can limit opportunities for the very people these policies were designed to protect. Likewise, severely limiting regulation in an effort to promote capital formation would invite fraud, mistrust, and misdeeds, eroding investor confidence and constricting the flow of capital, and again, hurting the very people such policies were designed to benefit. The need to strike the appropriate balance is also important regarding the relationship between our private and public markets, and currently that balance is out of alignment. Public markets require that the public is provided with material information, something that is essential to well-functioning markets and retail investor protection. According to the SEC in 2018, public offerings accounted for $1.4 trillion of new capital, compared to approximately $2.9 trillion estimated being raised in the private markets. However, that is only an estimate, and frankly, none of us knows the true amount, or who the investors are, or the success of those investments. This lack of information is something that policymakers should address. Further, private companies deciding to stay private longer and raise more capital while private has limited the number of IPOs and investment opportunities available to retail investors. In Vermont, retail investors were able to get in on the scoop of the action by investing in Ben & Jerry's just years from when the two founders learned how to make ice cream. And had they done that, they would have quadrupled their profits. Today, in many cases, retail investors are missing out on the upside growth of businesses that remain private. However, the answer to this challenge is not in policies designed to further expand private offerings to retail investors or create new exemptions. Congress should focus on reinvigorating and growing our public markets, keeping them transparent and trustworthy, and keeping them the envy of the financial world. NASA has submitted written testimony staking out our views on the bills under consideration today. However, I would like to highlight two. First, NASA strongly supports the Private Securities Transparency and Reform Act. Security regulators help police the private marketplace through our anti-fraud authority, and we are close proximity to the members of the investing public. Accordingly, we have a direct and vested interest in promoting the transparency and the reforms in the private marketplace. My office frequently receives calls inquiring about an investment opportunity an investor just learned about, wondering whether it's legitimate. If a Form D is not on file with my office or with the SEC, as frequently is the case, our only advice is to proceed with great caution. Requiring the pre-filing of Form D with the SEC would provide regulators with more information and help investors make more informed decisions. Similarly, a post-offering closing amendment with sales data would provide important resource of information about how private offerings are working to policymakers. A closing amendment allows regulators to better understand the relative success of this marketplace and who's investing. This would provide important information regarding, for example, how to best tailor private market exemptions and how to best tailor the accredited investor definition. Secondly, NASA supports the untitled draft that would require the SEC to submit a report to Congress about the securities exempted from registration under the Securities Act. The bill would ensure that key information, such as investor types, expected offering sizes, and the impacts on regulatory efforts in the public market, is collected so that the very federal agency charged with policing this market fully understands how those changes will impact other exempt offerings in the overall marketplace. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee. I'll be pleased to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you. Dr. Lowe, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good morning, Chair Maloney, Ranking Member Huizenga, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and other members of the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today. My name is Andrew Lowe, and I'm a financial economist by training and trade. I have the great privilege of teaching some of the brightest business students in the world. But I'm also an immigrant who came to the United States when I was 5 years old, grew up in a single-parent household in New York City, benefited from the New York City public school system from K through 12, the best education that money didn't have to buy, money that we didn't have. Became a citizen when I was a high school sophomore and has been involved in several successful startups since then. So I've experienced the American dream firsthand, and I owe a debt of gratitude to this country that I will never be able to fully repay. That's why I'm here today, to testify to the committee that the matters you're considering are really important, not just to Americans, but to entrepreneurs and investors around the world. The common theme of the legislation that you're considering is the desire to improve access to capital and lower the cost of innovation. And as an entrepreneur and a financial economist, I fully support these goals. The entrepreneurial spirit is part of America's DNA, and we are the envy of the world in this and many other respects. But as a student of the financial crisis of 2008, I remember the devastating consequences of uncontrolled financial innovation coupled with human behavior. It is possible to have too much of a good thing, and better access to capital doesn't always mean more access to capital. So we need to be thoughtful about how we formulate and promote innovation. And the regulations that are under consideration today for Regulation D and venture exchanges strike a balance between greater access to capital and mechanisms for identifying potential unintended consequences. I have more to say about these pieces of legislation in my written testimony, but I'd like to reserve the balance of my time to focus on the bill I'm most excited about, which is the Rare Disease Fund Act introduced by Congressman Vargas and Peters. This single piece of legislation will not only promote innovation and economic growth, but it'll do so by saving lives and creating high-paying jobs. By way of background, rare diseases are defined in the United States as any disease that affects 200,000 patients or less. Examples include hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, and Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Now, any one rare disease might affect a relatively small number of patients, but there are over 7,000 known rare diseases that collectively affect an estimated 30 million Americans, more than the number of cancer patients in this country. So this is not a small problem. Fortunately, biomedical experts have recently developed the scientific means to treat and in some cases cure a number of these rare diseases, many of which are fatal. Unfortunately, although we have the scientific means, we currently don't have the economic means to deal with them. That's where the Vargas-Peters legislation comes into play. Their proposal is to use two financial innovations, portfolio theory and securitization, to create a fund that would invest in a large number of rare disease drug development projects. These projects would then be funded by investors that would be accredited and under the full supervision of the SEC. The idea would be to create a fund that would be financed both by equity and by debt, and there would be multiple tranches of debt, one of which would have a government guarantee. The cost of that guarantee would be charged to the fund so as to make this budget neutral. And once that guaranteed bond issue it matures, the guarantee would sunset away, because the intention of this legislation is not for the government to replace the private sector function, but rather for the government to play a leadership role in catalyzing this particular market for the private sector. The RAD Fund bill shows that finance doesn't have to be a zero-sum game if we don't let it. This is a rare case where we can actually do well by doing good, and with your support, we can do it now. Thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer questions to the best of my abilities.
Mr. Elenoff, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony. Mike.
Sorry about that. I'm a partner at the New York-based law firm of Elenoff, Grossman & Scholl. I am a corporate and securities lawyer and have been practicing for over 30 years. My law firm has been in business for more than 25 years, and there are nearly 100 lawyers offering legal services in more than 10 practice areas. We are regularly one of the top 10 IPO law firms in the nation. This year alone, we've been involved in more than 20 IPOs. I spent nearly 5 years after the passage of the Jobs Act working with the leadership of the crowdfunding movement, traveling extensively, including dozens of trips to DC to provide our views on the proposed and final regulation crowdfunding rules. The various Jobs Act provisions were a meaningful advancement of our securities laws, and Congress should take a victory lap for causing their adoption. Crowdfund Capital Advisors indicates that several thousand jobs have been created since the implementation of the regulation, and nearly 1,000 companies have been funded. 48 of the 50 states have had their entrepreneurs raise capital through these exemptions. I'm currently counsel to the Association of Online Portals, who is having an event here in DC on Monday, and I have had a prior association with the Crowdfund Intermediary Regulatory Authority. I am chairman and co-founder of iDisclose, a law cloud, a legal technology document automations company that has been utilized by crowdfunding entrepreneurs 200+ times to prepare and file their required Form C disclosure documents with the SEC. iDisclose has also developed apps for filing PPMs and Reg A+ filings. I'm also co-founder of GUARD, another development stage legal technology company that provides updated and ongoing disclosure of private issuers to facilitate secondary trading of their securities. My comments are those of my own, not my firm, nor my partners, clients, or the associations to which I am affiliated. I've disassociated myself from a lot of folks. While we all recognize that there are collective charges to calibrate the proper balance between capital formation and investor protection, many of us disagree to some extent on how to practically implement that foundational concept into both the private and public securities market to make them function in a more efficient and responsible manner. Today, we are continuing the dialogue to better understand how our markets actually operate and what changes we should consider implementing to improve them further. Even if we had the proper formula for that balance between raising funds and protecting investors in years past, public markets continue to change, and I think it is fair to say that for many, including our most visible and successful entrepreneurs, remaining private longer is the preferred approach. In the span of my professional experience, we have seen a dramatic decline in the number and appeal of public offerings and corresponding increase in the interest of remaining private, free of regulatory burden and expense. I can't emphasize that enough. In many ways, the reasons for this transformation are less important and too complex to unpack, but the very real need to honestly acknowledge and respond to these realities is undeniable. With less than a few hundred companies making the determination to go public each year, I would argue that the private markets and public markets exist for two very different reasons and constituents. While we want the private markets to be our funnel or farm team to the big leagues of being public, there are less than 10,000 publicly traded companies in the U.S. and millions of private companies, with hundreds of thousands of companies that have raised outside investor capital. So while we should be cognizant of the relationship, how these two markets interact, and how and why private companies in particular elect to pursue an IPO or become public through other means, we should, in my judgment, ensure both markets are operating optimally and regulate only to the extent absolutely necessary. For this reason, I am here to provide testimony in support of broadening the definition of accredited investors to also include appropriately credentialed professionals, also permitting the use of the SPVs for regulation crowdfunding, approving the M&A broker proposal, which effectively codifies the SEC's recent no-action letter regarding the same, so that small business brokers who provide services to small privately held companies need only to comply with a simplified registration process, approving the creation of the venture exchanges to facilitate secondary market liquidity for the thousands and thousands of privately financed investments. I'm also here to voice my concern and disapproval of the amendments to the Form D for the pre-filing and also the elimination of that exemption if you fail to file the form. And lastly, the associated market study that accompanies that. And lastly, with my remaining 10 seconds, I want to congratulate NASA for their 100-year anniversary and Michael for his tour of duty running that organization.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Dr. Jones, you noted in your testimony that the growth of the private markets has been driven by several different changes, policy changes over the past few decades. In your view, what was the most important policy change that drove the growth of the private markets? Was it increasing the shareholder threshold for public companies from 500 to 2,000?
I would say the most important policy change that has caused the increased delay in IPOs is most likely the amendment to Section 12G of the 1934 Act. Other important changes include, I think, amendments to Rule 144, which allows shareholders in private companies, including employees, to resell their shares after just 1 year.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. DeFontenay, you argued that one factor driving the growth of private markets has been the historically low interest rates we've had since the financial crisis. If that's the case, and monetary policy is playing a role here, do you think that the private markets will shrink back down when the Fed raises interest rates to normal levels?
Thank you. It's hard to say how much they will shrink back down to where they were in the pre-1980s levels. I think is the cat's out of the bag. That will not occur, but I certainly think that there will be a correction if interest rates rise materially, because much of what we're seeing in the private markets is showing clear signs of overheating as a result of the extraordinarily low cost of capital. So, for example, I know that this committee in particular has looked at concerns around leveraged loans, the increasingly high leverage ratios in many firms, including in particular private equity acquired firms. Signs of overheating also include the decline in underwriting standards for corporate debt. They include, and this is something that Dr. Jones talks about, the increasingly founder-friendly terms in venture finance deals, which result in ultimately in huge valuation problems and huge corporate governance issues being revealed when these companies start making motions towards going public. And so, long story short, yes, I think that the low interest rate environment clearly has an effect on the private markets, and I think they are due for a correction.
Okay. And Dr. Pichik, as you mentioned in your testimony, Congress really supercharged the growth of so-called private placements in 1996 when it preempted state security laws for these offerings. And do you think more companies would be going public if these private placements didn't benefit from state preemption?
Yes, Chairwoman, I do. I believe that was the first of a series of policy decisions that really led to the culminating effect of the private marketplace being really the place where companies were enticed and incentivized to be, to the detriment of the public marketplace, to the point now where, as I mentioned, you have considerably more, if not dwarfing the amount of capital being raised in the private markets versus the public markets. So again, the impact of that is less opportunity for retail investors. We have less readily available information about the companies in our private marketplace. We see misdeeds in our private marketplace, whether from valuation standpoint, fraud standpoint, or just general misdeed standpoint. So that's the impact, and Congress should really be focusing on how do we reverse that, and how do we incentivize the capital public markets.
Thank you. And Dr. Lowe, you noted that the rare disease fund created by Mr. Vargas's bill would have to buy a large number of rare disease therapeutics in order to increase the odds that at least one of the therapeutics in the fund's portfolio would be successful. How long would it take the fund's portfolio manager to buy up that many rare disease candidates? Would it take years to assemble this portfolio, or is this something that a portfolio manager can do relatively quickly? And any other comments you have on your proposal?
Well, as I mentioned, there are over 7,000 rare diseases, and fortunately, there are a lot of biomedical experts out there developing potential therapies for these diseases. So I suspect that in a matter of months, one could put together a very impressive portfolio of 5 to 10 projects. Mm-hmm. In a matter of 3 to 5 years, you can easily have more than 25 to 50 of these projects.
Well, thank you. My time has expired, and the gentleman from Michigan, Ranking Member Huizenga, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that, and I will note, Mr. Pichek, There is nothing more sweet than being a past president of any organization. So enjoy this coming year.
Although my first day is here.
Yeah, well, okay, it's got nowhere to go but up. All right, let's call that a holdover from your punishment for last year. Let me start with you, actually, and we've heard. I'm going to talk specifically about my bill, HR 609, that what we're trying to do is create a registration exemption. Some have said that it completely deregulates small business mergers and acquisition transactions. But I'm curious, does the SEC and do states still retain jurisdiction and authority over M&A brokers as brokers, even when not registered, and do anti-fraud laws still apply?
Yes, both the SEC and states would retain anti-fraud jurisdiction over these actions, so it wouldn't be a completely unregulated marketplace.
So you wouldn't necessarily view this as a threat to small business?
No, as an M&A lawyer myself, I've worked with some of these M&A brokers. I've seen them sell family businesses, provide liquidity that's needed to those family businesses. We think the bill, as drafted, really codifies the no action letter that the SEC has operated under from 2014. But as was pointed out, those letters can change. The bill contains important investor protections relating to prohibition of bad actors, caps on the size of transactions. We also have adopted a NASA model along the same lines, and in Vermont we have adopted that NASA model. So we're supportive of the bill. We have a tweak that would request that the SEC is required to implement certain investor protections, I think we've mentioned in our testimony. But beyond that, we are supportive of this bill.
Yeah, and actually, some would argue, I would argue that we actually may be more restrictive than the no action letter from the SEC because we have a $25 million cap.
Yeah, and there's no cap on the SEC.
No cap. In fact, we give the SEC the ability to review it, lower it, or keep it the same, raise it. They have the ability to review that. So I appreciate that. Mr. Elenoff, speaking as a corporate and securities lawyer, do you see aggrieved private company sellers or buyers turning to the SEC or state securities regulators for their protection? And what do the parties rely upon for their protection?
Well, in 30 years of practice and doing a fair amount of M&A as well, working with business brokers, investment bankers, I've never even heard the suggestion that somehow an aggrieved party would want to reach out to the SEC as it related to small business transactions. I don't think they think of those transactions as being under the jurisdictions of the SEC, notwithstanding Michael's point that they actually do have jurisdiction. So I think they would look to the courts in the first instance.
What is the legal effect of an SEC staff no action letter? I mean, do we really need to be going through this exercise to have codification in the legislation?
Actually, absolutely. When I saw it, I thought it was quite wise. It's guidance. It is not. It's not controlling authority for other business brokers necessarily to rely on. So to codify it, in my mind, enshrines it and therefore keeps it for quite some time in place.
Well, while I would love to bask in the word of wise that you used, with my name attached to this bill, it actually came to my attention through a local attorney who has done work with that out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, who was chair of the law panel that had oversight of this and had been reviewing this, and they have suggested this for a decade plus now to the SEC. So we are trying to then just sort of get it over the line here. So I appreciate your enthusiasm for it. While we're on this large,
I reiterate it.
That's okay. We got it on tape. I do want to talk a little bit about this IPO situation in the last few seconds here. I mean, we're hearing what seemingly sounds like companies should be forced to become public once they reach a certain size or maybe a certain importance to communities or to society. That doesn't strike me as the right tone as we're talking about what Dr. Lowe was talking about, opportunity. With having folks come and try new ideas. So, the remaining couple of seconds, if you want to just maybe comment on that.
I have no disagreement with the observation. I think companies that want to go public to access the public markets and have research coverage and liquidity, and it makes sense for them, then they should do it. Otherwise, they should remain private. And I take note of Dr. Jones's observations, and I think we should look into those sorts of things, generally speaking, to make sure we're not making a larger, creating a larger problem, but at the same time, I think they should be able to remain private.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and ranking members, and thank you for including my draft legislation, the Rare Disease Fund Act, in this hearing. And Dr. Lowe, let me start by expressing my gratitude to you and Dr. Roger Stein, who's also in the audience today, for your pioneering research on the early stage drug development financing and for working with my office to develop this legislation. And I have to say, your spontaneous thankfulness for the opportunities that our nation has given you is rather moving on 9/11. Thank you. Many of us today were down on the steps, and I think it was quite moving. So again, thank you. I do want to ask you, though, if you could elaborate a bit more on the megafund model and how it is structured, one, and why rare diseases in particular are suited for this megafund model.
Well, the basic idea behind the megafund model is to use portfolio theory, not putting all your eggs in one basket, diversifying across a large number of shots on goal, to use a hockey or soccer analogy, and to do so by financing it with both equity and debt. The idea being that if you have a large number of shots on goal, the chances that one or two of them would succeed is fairly high, and all you need in the drug development world is one or two successes to pay for all of the other shots on goal. Why rare diseases? Well, aside from the humanitarian and ethical reasons, it turns out that rare diseases have a really interesting statistical property. The success or failure of a drug development project for one rare disease has virtually nothing to do with the success or failure of a different rare disease. They are almost, by definition, statistically independent. And that independence provides you with tremendous diversification opportunities from a purely financial perspective. So by putting together even 10 or 20 of these projects, you will get a much lower risk for the overall portfolio. And it's that risk reduction that investors seek, that investors benefit from, and that could actually bring more money into this space.
Would that same risk reduction work on other treatments like cancer, Alzheimer's, or not really because of the risk?
Well, it really depends on the nature of those risks and the underlying projects. For example, if you consider a cancer megafund, the fact is that one angiogenesis inhibitor failing is probably not good news for the 5 other angiogenesis inhibitors that are being investigated by scientists. So you've got correlation among these various different projects. The more correlation that you have, the less diversification, the less risk reduction, and the less attractive it will be from an investor's point of view, and therefore you're going to need much more capital. So the size of the fund is actually related to the statistical properties of the underlying drug development projects.
So if we kept it simply for rare diseases, what do you expect the default rates would be then for rare diseases because of the risk?
Well, in a piece of research that we published 3 or 4 years ago in the journal Science Translational Medicine in collaboration with the NIH, we used their data for rare disease therapeutics to estimate what a megafund for this particular market would look like. And for a portfolio of 16 projects that required something like $400 million, we were estimating default rates on the order of 10 to 20 basis points for the most senior tranche, and the junior tranche would have a default rate of something like 70 or 80 basis points.
So if that is the risk, then who would be the target investors here? One of the things we're looking at today is getting more people involved. Who are the target investors for this type of risk?
Well, the target investors would actually be institutional investors, investors like pension funds that are focusing on fixed income securities to be able to boost the returns of their retirees' portfolio. And it would be funds that have a more patient capital that would be willing to take on risk that would last maybe 5 to 10 years.
And why not an entirely debt-financed fund?
Well, from a purely financial economic point of view, if you've got 100% debt, your probability of default is 1. You'll always go bankrupt. And so you can't have 100% debt financing. There has to be some portion of equity. Somebody has to have skin in the game, otherwise the bondholders are going to be left holding the bag.
And I guess lastly, I would ask this. The reason I got involved was So many of us do know people that have rare diseases. And you think of rare disease as something that is rare, but in fact it's not rare because there are so many of them. Could you explain a little more about that? Because I think most of us do have friends, family members who have these rare diseases.
Well, it's a terribly frustrating situation when your child has some affliction that no doctor really understands, and that's part of the nature of rare diseases. It's very, very hard to diagnose because of the complexity of the underlying diseases. Many of them are caused by genetic mutations, typically in just a single gene. And because of the Human Genome Project, we now know how to sequence our genes, we know how to identify these defects that can be corrected in certain cases. So the technology is all there. But what we don't have is the economic means, particularly at the early stages of drug discovery. So while it may be true that in other industries there's plenty of capital for small businesses, I would argue that that is not true in the biotechnology industry, that there is a valley of death between basic scientific research and commercialization, and that's really what the Vargas-Peters bill is going to help deal with.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from North Carolina is now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. McHenry.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your leadership, Chairwoman Maloney. I want to raise with you, Mr. Elenoff, about investment crowdfunding and the Jobs Act. We know that public listings have gone down in public markets. Economy's gotten larger. We have more businesses in America today than we did a generation ago, but fewer public companies than we did a generation ago. We know the private markets have grown 7 times faster than the public markets in recent years. So just for a baseline here, remind me, can everyday investors access these private markets?
Through 2 distinct ways. One is you can have up to 35 non-accredited investors in a Reg D offering, but primarily, in answer to direct response to your question, is through the Title III provisions of the Jobs Act passed in 2012. Retail investors can have limited exposure to investing in private securities.
So very limited, right? So if you have a pension fund, that is your only access for broad-based investors to have any sort of connection with the private markets.
That would be correct.
Okay, so we have a larger issue in America with labor being disconnected with the value of their labor and what it creates in corporate benefit in really the valuation of the company, and yet we have a limitation on labor, the average person in a company, to have ownership in that connection with innovative companies, and a little bit of risk, not taking their whole life savings and put it in their company stock or their local local small business, but having a little bit of access to that and the growth potential there. So why is that limitation there?
It's written in the statute. The statute specifically says that any American can invest up to $2,000.
No. So that's getting into investment crowdfunding, but broad-based, the broad-based limitation on everyday investors investing in the private market.
Unless there's an exemption from registration that the SEC.
Right, because there's a societal decision that if you're not a high net worth individual, you're dumb, and that is implicit in securities regulation. Dr. Lowe, I mean, not to overstate it for MIT economists here, but pretty simple. There's a decision by Congress and policymakers that net worth equals intelligence, and therefore we're cutting off people that maybe don't have high net worth but are deeply versed. So one example I would have is that when Ben Bernanke was chairman of the Federal Reserve, he could not invest. He was not an accredited investor because he didn't meet the wealth standard. He's chairman of the largest bank on the planet, right? And this is one of the great limitations. So as a part of the Jobs Act, we wanted to have the opportunity for investment crowdfunding, taking a small piece with limitation and protections. That's the reason why Congresswoman Maloney was the lead Democrat on this bill. And with her work, we had a massive number of investor protections we added to the bill and this limitation constraint. And I was willing to make that compromise because I thought the opportunity was good. Then we have from the SEC over 500 pages of regulation around or less than 20 pages of legislative text. So, Dr. Lowe, you say that there's appetite for more investment crowdfunding, but Mr. Elenoff, you mentioned the high cost structure for these offerings, which then limit really the economic return for small dollar offerings.
The burdens of any kind of preparation of disclosure that needs to be filed with the SEC is an undertaking. It takes time, energy, and resources, and for up to $1,070,000 potential financings, the cost of doing that is a meaningful percentage of the proceeds that are raised in those deals, and it's out of pocket before you even know if you've raised the money.
So last Congress, Chairwoman Waters, Maxine Waters, was a co-sponsor of my bill. It was a crowdfunding amendment act, which would allow for special purpose vehicles. Is that some reasonable and responsible way to make crowdfunding work in your view, Dr. Lowe?
It's certainly one way, and I think that it's important to be able to bring more capital into this space. At the same time, I also think that we want to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences, so it's worth monitoring these kinds of situations.
That's why it's a low dollar offering. That's why it's a cap. That's why it's pretty onerous on individual investments, so you can't take Nana's life savings and invest it in some risky one-shot deal. Mr. Elenoff, you mentioned special purpose vehicles as being a potential solution. I appreciate your testimony. With that, yield back.
Okay. Thank you. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you for convening this very important hearing on such a crucial topic. Thank you all to all of our witnesses for coming in here today. I think one of the responsibilities that we have as a committee, in addition to pursuing oversight and investigation and carefully vetting these issues, is to make sure that we are illuminating these issues to the public. As so often, very critical legislation comes before this committee and with terminology that the average American finds difficult to understand. So I want to ask a few questions today for the purpose of illuminating the public as to what is going on. Right now, we have two core overall categories of investment, correct, Ms. DeFontenay? We have IPOs, you have the public market, that's your NASDAQ, that's your exchanges, and then you have private markets where you hear about people investing in pre-IPO companies like Uber and Facebook before it went to the market and so on, correct?
Correct.
And so some of these private markets that we hear about the most on the news tend to be these early stage tech companies, these unicorns that you mentioned, Ms. Jones, like your Snapchats, your pre-IPO Twitter, and there's this idea that you can really get rich if you get in on the ground at these early companies before they get to the public market, correct?
That's correct.
But we have this big issue where if you are what is known as a retail investor or pretty much an everyday person, there's this idea that you want to get into the private market, that is more desirable, that there's more of an upside, but there's a large amount of risk involved. So if you're an everyday person and you're saying, hey, I want to get in on the next Uber, would you have access to a reliable valuation of that private company when you invest, Ms. DeFontenay?
You would not have access to a reliable valuation. So unlike the public markets where investors can assume that the price of the security is correctly determined. So the market efficiency makes it so that you don't have to do any research. You can buy it and know that that's the correct price. It doesn't work that way at all on the private markets.
Mm-hmm. And would you have any, would you be informed of any audited, or would you receive any audited financial statements?
There is no requirement that you receive audited financial statements.
Any potential, I was just
going to say, yeah, investors who have sufficient bargaining power, the big venture capital funds, can negotiate for disclosure, but retail investors are extraordinarily unlikely to get.
And let's say if the government launched an investigation into any one of these companies as they are private, would you be informed of that?
There is no requirement to disclose that.
As a retail investor, as an everyday person, would you have the same rights as large institutional investors?
No, it's very common for differential rights in private firms. So this is really the opposite of the public markets, where everyone's in the same security, common stock for the most part. Everyone has the same rights, everyone has the same information. In the private markets, it's all entirely differentiated, and it's determined by the bargaining power of the investors.
And so when you try to kind of wade into these private markets, you're taking on a very large amount of risk, correct? Potentially.
Considerable amount of risk. So the odds that you would get in early in Uber, for example, that you would even have access to the promising startups is extraordinarily remote.
And for every one Uber or for every one big company, which still can be risky, I'm sure there's tons of other companies that can take on a lot of investment, fail without any of that disclosure, correct?
The failure rate is very high. The beauty of the public markets is that you can be in an index fund and you will get the benefit of the winners and spread out the losses of the losers. There's no such potential to create a vehicle like that in the private markets, and so you will be taking on substantially more risk.
And so to kind of illustrate this point, we recently saw just last week an issue with WeWork, where WeWork was making this transition from the private markets, trying to get ready for an IPO to the public market. And they had raised on a previous valuation of $47 billion. And now they just decided overnight, just kidding, we're worth $20 billion. They've cut it by over half, correct?
Do you want to take this one?
I guess what I would say in response to that is that the private valuations of pre-IPO unicorns that are published in the newspaper, whether it's $70 billion for Uber or any other company, they're highly speculative, and more importantly, they tend to be based on the last financing that was completed. But as Professor DeFontenay says, the investors in that last round of financing typically have bargained for superior rights than every prior investor. So the numbers that are floating around in the newspaper are speculative and to some extent distorted.
Very quickly, so you're an everyday person trying to access this opportunity. You don't get any access to disclosures. You don't get any financial statements in the private market. All you have to rely on is basically these public articles to get an idea if you're trying to invest outside of the public market, correct?
That's correct, unless the issuer agrees to disclose.
And so if you invested in WeWork thinking that it had a valuation of
Time is
$47 billion, you're getting fleeced.
Possibly.
Thank you. And the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate you holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. And my colleague from New York, I think, made a good case for why there are protections in the private markets for retail investors, including that they're more risky. Retail investors would not have access to accurate valuations, audited financials, or disclosure of government investigations. So I'd like to just go down the panel. Do you think it's appropriate to have some protections in private markets for retail investors? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, but we should be limiting the ability, we should be promoting retail investors to the public markets.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, but retail investors are not in.
And that's where I'm going. So there are protections for retail investors. We have a definition of what's called an accredited investor. The gentleman from North Carolina very eloquently explained that there is a predisposition in that rule that assumes wealth equals knowledge. Accredited investor essentially means somebody worth $1 million. I know lots of people worth $1 million that are not very smart, and I know a lot of people that are not worth $1 million that are super smart. Wealth does not equal knowledge. Can we just go down the panel? Does wealth equal knowledge? Is the definition of accredited investor correct in the regulations today?
I would say wealth doesn't equal knowledge, but the wealth does provide that investor
No, I understand.
better
Yeah.
ability to sustain a loss.
Cushion, sure, yep.
Agreed.
And the only point I would add to that is not only is it not necessarily that the person is sophisticated, but that they can get sophisticated advice to make
Right,
decisions.
that's correct, okay.
Agreed.
Agree with the panelists.
Great, so now let's talk about the definition of accredited investor. Do you think there should be some more opportunity for folks that are sophisticated, that have knowledge and have access to sophisticated advice, to become accredited investors. I understand that wealth can provide you a cushion for losses, but a fool and his money are soon parted. So is there a better way to define who an accredited investor is for private markets? Then I want to get into public markets, but if we could just go through this really quickly.
Sure. So what I would say is that under Rule 506, sophisticated investors can participate in private offerings, and it's the issuers in general that are excluding the sophisticated investors because they don't want to make the requisite disclosure. So the law on the private placement exemption already accommodates, and even Section 4A2 already accommodates investment by sophisticated investors regardless of their wealth.
I think it's fair to say that somebody with a PhD in finance should be qualified as an accredited investor. The one question, though, is whether issuers prefer bright line rules. So the current rule has the merit of being very easy.
It's easy to understand.
It's easy to do. So there's some balancing
Understood.
there of the interests of the two.
And if you're going to expand the accredited investor definition to professionals or people with expertise, I think it's in line with having a larger conversation about how to better tailor the accredited investor definition, because I think there's some people in there that shouldn't be in there, and others, as we're talking about
I
today.
think that is a totally fair point, and that's where I want to go with private markets before we move on. But yeah, thank you.
In this country, we require people to take lessons and pass a test in order to have a driver's license and operate a motor vehicle. I believe you can do the same thing with accredited investors. Give them a test.
Great point.
And be able to invest.
Unfortunately, I'm at the end of the line. I agree with a lot of the comments that have already been made. We should
That's-
broaden the definition and even consider a test.
So, and I think that's where I want to go with private markets, is that the current system for accredited investor includes people that should not be included and excludes some people that should not be excluded. So I think we need to fix it. I think it's something we should work on and make better. That does not fix the point of some of the issuers denying retail investors access, because especially sophisticated investors, and that's another thing to deal with. But the key point is that I think the definition of accredited investor denies people that should have access and includes people that probably shouldn't have access. So we need to have a more thoughtful approach on that moving forward. Let's move to public markets. Mr. Elenoff, can you discuss how the Jobs Act of 2012 might have helped American companies, especially startups, reduce costs, gain access to capital, and grow into public companies?
Very quickly, Title I reduced the cost of those companies that want to go on-ramp to being public by reducing the accounting requirements from 3 years to 2 years. That's significant savings in accounting fees and legal fees. And you see the same go through to Title II and Title III. And the broad point on Title II is the amount of money raised by those issuers was greater than 506B offerings during that same period of time. So they raised more investors, more money.
Thank you. My time has expired, but I want to follow up with some questions in writing. I really appreciate all of you for being here. There's a lot to unpack here. I appreciate you helping us. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you all for being here. I want to muse for a second and just ask a question about private offerings. Look, I think the underlying concept makes sense, right? Retail investors, I very much agree with Dr. DeFontenay. Retail investor knowledge and performance and behavior is troubling, and very sophisticated investors don't need the kind of hand-holding. So I get the concept. And I supported the Jobs Act because I, too, am troubled by the contraction of the public markets. And what troubles me about it, amongst other things, is it feels to me like we're moving into a world where high returns exist in the private market. Now, by the way, I understand that with high returns comes higher risk. But I am troubled by the fact that we're moving into a world where the private market is the market that delivers 15% and 20% returns to venture capitalists and to private equity and to accredited investors. And then as a second phase, literally as a second phase, public markets deliver single-digit returns to retail investors. So I have a few questions about Mr. Vargas's legislation, so I want to allocate maybe 2 minutes to this. But here's my question. When I talk, as so often is the case, I feel like we may be not addressing the main issue. When I talk to CEOs, when I talk to entrepreneurs, what they tell me is that it's not the regulation fight that we have here. They don't care that much about 144A versus public registration. What they say is they can't stand the short-term focus of the public markets, of getting hammered because they missed their EPS guidance on the third quarter by 1 cent when they're actually pursuing something visionary. So are we missing the point? Because again, everything I hear, and I understand that anecdotes is not data, suggests that the issue is that in the public markets encourage a quarter-by-quarter short-term focus that is not true in the private markets. Don't know who wants to take that, but I'm interested.
I can start. So if you believe in market efficiency, then you think that the current stock price does reflect all of the company's future prospects. So that is an ongoing debate. What I would say is that the founders' bargaining power has shifted dramatically. They have, because of the low interest rate environment, they have significant bargaining power, and so they are using that to get more and more control and be less and less responsive to investors. And so it is worth at least pausing and taking what they say with a little bit of grain of salt. So the fact that they don't want the discipline of the public capital markets is certainly, I think, driving their decisions to stay private, but whether we agree with that or not is a very difficult question.
But you used the word discipline. Again, discipline is a different word from short-term focus, right? Again, I just hear from all of these people that it's the quarterly reporting and the short-term focus that draws them to the private market.
I don't think that the capital markets are consistent with that. So if you look at companies like Tesla or Google or Apple, these are extraordinarily innovative companies with very, very long-term focus. And so I think public company shareholders actually are willing to tolerate long-term planning.
Okay, I was in the public markets for a long time. I'm not sure that's true, but I'm running out of time, and I have a few questions for Dr. Lowe on the VARs. I would, Chairwoman, I would like to pursue this. Again, I think that's where the problem is short-term versus long-term focus. But Dr. Lowe, I have not had a chance to talk to my good friend, Congressman Vargas, about his idea, but I'm intrigued by it. There's an analog for a private fund in another world I live in, which is In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel is a IC-sponsored venture fund, essentially. But I have two questions. Number one, I understand the concept of diversification of risk. It uncomfortably reminds me of the structure of mortgage-backed securities, where you took some very risky paper and supposedly made them less risky. We don't have time to get into the numbers, but my question is this: if this makes sense financially for investors, why do you need a government role to establish it? Why isn't somebody out there establishing it? And number two, why the SEC? They are not in the business of starting or managing funds. If you take the In-Q-Tel example, it's vertical sector expertise. Why not the NIH if you want to sort of establish a venture-ish fund?
Well, in terms of why the SEC versus the NIH, the idea is that we want to make sure that this fund doesn't go the way of a number of the mortgage-backed securities funds, and that it is properly structured so that shareholders are protected and that it follows the appropriate rules. The other aspect of the mortgage-backed securities crisis was that the correlations actually changed dramatically when the economy went down. And that's the key aspect of the failure of these mortgage-backed securities, that the diversification...
But I'm out of time. Let's not focus on MBS. If this makes sense for investors, why do you need the government putting it together?
I think the idea is for the government to catalyze, not to replace the private sector, to start it off. And already the private sector has made progress partway, but because of the extraordinary risk of early-stage drug discovery, you need to have a nonprofit party start it off. And in some cases, philanthropists can do that. But in this case, the challenge is so large that we really need to have the government involved.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Okay, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair very much. And as we have this discussion, and just going back for those that are paying attention to this important hearing, we're talking about examining private market exemptions as a barrier to public offerings and retail, or what I call mainstream investors. So I just want to set things up because I don't know if it's been made clear that the public company model has become increasingly unattractive to businesses over the past few years. And the United States has now roughly half the number of public companies than it did 20 years ago. And not only are fewer companies going public, but the companies that do are typically doing so much later in their life cycle, which has repercussions down the road in terms of who actually can get in terms of investment. Mr. Elenoff, how does a company going public not only benefit the economy in terms of jobs, but also America's Main Street investors that I care so deeply about back in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District?
Well, I appreciate the question. The point I would make is that the differential between the large 1,000 IPOs of years ago versus the 250, 300 that we're at now, if you back out the unicorns, there's a whole cross-section of hundreds of smaller companies to which the cost of reporting and the burdens of regulation and the timing of earnings is a serious consideration. Once they've made the determination to go forward and go public, the benefits are not only the creation of jobs, the visibility of their results. Portfolio managers can now own those shares, which translates to retail investors having participation in those securities. There are a range of different reasons for them going public.
Do any of the bills discussed in this hearing encourage companies to begin the IPO process?
In an odd way, the venture exchange model does, because it's creating secondary, well, actually, I'll take that back. While I'm in favor of the venture exchange model because it creates secondary liquidity for private companies, it in and of itself isn't taking them public through the public markets that you're referring to. None of them specifically do.
Do any of them encourage companies to identify and attract new investors?
They create the groundwork for many more private companies to be created, and those companies, which I call the farm team, then may elect in the future to go public in the traditional public offering route.
Mr. Elenoff, SEC Chair Jay Clayton has described exemptions from registration with the Commission as, he called it, an elaborate patchwork, and has noted that he doubts that anyone starting with a blank slate would have come up with the complex system that we have today. Do you agree with the chairman?
Fully.
Is the elaborate patchwork difficult for small companies to navigate?
It's not only difficult, it's probably impossible for most small entrepreneurs to understand the rules. Most securities lawyers have difficulty with it as well.
Do you support an effort to streamline or modernize the exemptions as the Commission may be considering, as evidenced by the recent concept release on the harmonization of securities offerings?
I do, fully.
Would the Democrats' proposed SEC study bill, which would require a series of findings before making any changes to the exemptions framework or creating a new exemption, hinder the SEC's efforts to make a more sensible framework for investors?
I believe it would. I mean, the SEC has embarked on an ambitious endeavor to try and reconcile all the exemptions. I think it's time to let them do their jobs and not interfere. There's plenty of data that I've already read about the private markets that the SEC puts out. I'm comfortable that embarking in that direction would only hinder it, as you point out.
Does throwing up barriers to streamlining the offering framework seem like the right thing to do at this time?
Not in my judgment.
Thank you. I appreciate all of our witnesses today. I appreciate your testimony, and I yield back the few seconds that I have.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Porter, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Elenoff, have you ever gotten a blood test before?
I have.
And if the blood test came back normal, which I hope it has, did you feel relieved?
I appreciate your concern, and yes.
What if you got a blood test back and it said you were healthy, but in fact you were very ill? Would that be a cause for concern for you?
It would be.
Have you ever heard of a company called Theranos?
I've read Bad Blood.
So Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes and her partner raised more than $700 million from investors to fund fake blood tests, correct?
That's correct. Well, I believe that to be true.
Ms. Jones, turning to you for a moment, you talk about Theranos in your law review article. How is it that they were able to raise $700 million for an entirely fake concept? How is it that investors didn't know that?
They raised it from the brilliant accredited investors. So they raised it in private financing. The investors, a lot of, I guess, informed investors in the healthcare industry passed on the investment, but other investors were interested in the idea and the concept and believed that it was real. And in the structure that they created, the founder of the company had control over the board. And when directors heard about problems, they either didn't believe them or ignored them. And so this one person, the founder, was just able to trick or deceive investors and the board and some of their employees.
If Theranos had been a public offering, what would have been the disclosure regime?
Well, for a public offering, you have to file a Form S-1 registration statement, which includes comprehensive disclosure about the company's business, about its financial performance, and you also have to disclose any legal problems or any potential problems that might impact the company's future prospects or future growth. So the process of preparing for an IPO typically involves kind of all hands on decks with lawyers, accountants, and everybody else and underwriters scrubbing the company looking for potential problems. So even the understanding that you're going to have to go through that process really forces the company and its directors to keep a very close, tight rein on management. But when we've created a situation where we can delay an IPO indefinitely, a lot of those housekeeping measures can also be delayed, and again, that creates an atmosphere where fraud can occur.
So the goal is to create an accurate body of information for investors to rely on.
Exactly.
So turning back to Mr. Elenoff, with regard to blood tests, we've established, I think, that we prefer correct information to incorrect information and more information to less information. And we prefer to have quality controls in place to make sure that you're getting scientifically sound information. Are you aware of any other private market securities offerings besides Theranos that ended similarly disastrously? Any other kind of snake oil salesmen that have recently raised a bunch of money?
I'm aware of a lot of public companies like Enron that have done the same thing.
I appreciate that, and I, believe you me, am no fan of Enron.
So the broader point is there are companies without good corporate governance, which is why I don't see it as really a public versus private issue, but it's a corporate governance related issue, and investors, whether they're private or public, ought to impose good discipline like we're seeing in WeWorks now.
Okay, but so with public companies, there is some of that discipline created by that registration process statement. It can go awry later in the company's life, but that is, which is what happened with Enron, but that is different than at the early stages of the company. In 2018, the SEC brought enforcement actions against the perpetrators of a $1.2 billion Ponzi scheme that defrauded thousands of investors, including older Americans, against the pastor of one of the biggest churches in the country who cheated seniors by selling them interests in worthless pre-revolutionary Chinese bonds, and two former high-ranking Equifax employees who traded in advance of the company's announcement of their gigantic data breach that exposed the personal information of about half of all Americans. If we lived in a perfect world, we would not need to have these kinds of disclosures, but we don't live in that world. I want to use my last few seconds to just express my concern about the Fair Investment Opportunities Professionals Act and point out that to be an investment advisor, all one must do is get a low C, a C minus, on a 3-hour multiple guess test. And to me, that is not the level of expert that we ought to be allowing to waste or risk their own money, much less others' money. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Thanks for convening this important hearing. Thanks for bringing leadership to our capital markets effort, including bringing back so many of the provisions that were contained in the Jobs 3.0 bill last fall, where we had 32 underlying measures to improve our capital markets that passed the House overwhelmingly 406-4. So thank you very much for talking about some of those bills today, as well as some new ideas. And I particularly appreciate your effort to bring up the accredited investor bill that I've proposed. This bill would expand the definition of accredited investor to include professional experts, including the greater number of sophisticated investors into the marketplace. I do this from personal experience. I spent 40 years in finance, and about 25 of that was in the investment banking, private placement arena, so I come at it with some experience and work with state securities commissioners all over the country and the commission. So this comes from both a practical point of view that I bring, as well as my good friend from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, formerly a member of this committee, now a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, who led this legislation in the 114th and 115th Congress, where it passed the Congress with a strong bipartisan vote, 347-8. And Madam Chair, I'd like to enter a statement from Mr. Schweikert for the record. Thank you, ma'am. This legislation, in my view, benefits small businesses, entrepreneurs, and emerging companies. Under current law, accredited investors are not allowed to purchase securities that haven't been registered with the SEC. These types of offerings typically carry more risk than public offerings, as we've talked about this morning. The thought is that individuals with enough financial sophistication or net worth can bear potential loss that may be associated with these type of securities. However, the definitions of an accredited investor is solely based on wealth, and as our distinguished Securities Commissioner put in his testimony, these changes really haven't been made substantively since the 1980s as related to inflation adjustment. The ability to participate in private offerings should not be limited to individuals that simply passed some sort of a wealth test. Instead, the ability to participate should be expanded to include individuals who demonstrate that they have sufficient understanding of the offering. That may be a doctor who's gone through the training and wants to invest in a new piece of medical equipment, or a scientist who's done research in the lab and wants to invest in a new product that he's been studying and working on for years, but he or she doesn't have the net worth to meet the current statutory test. My bill and the work of Mr. Schweikert would expand the definition of accredited investors to allow professionals that invest in ventures that they understand. The expansion of the accredited investor definition will enhance the ability of many companies, particularly small businesses and entrepreneurs, to raise capital and grow by increasing the pool of potential investors. This will benefit both greater investment opportunities for Americans. I'm glad we're considering this legislation this week and having this hearing today, because tomorrow we hope to launch in the House of Representatives the Entrepreneurship Caucus. I'll be joining my colleagues from this committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, and the Small Business Committee to lead a caucus that will focus on ways to counteract the decline in business formation and direct innovation. And we'll analyze these pieces of legislation today. I might say, listening to the debate this morning and my experience in Reg D public-private placements over the years, I've really never heard it argued that because it's relatively straightforward to do a high net worth, accredited investor private placement, that somehow that's diminished opportunities for public companies. For much of the 4.5 years I've served in Congress now, we've heard a completely different scenario, which is that director and officer liability, the change in corporate governance and proxy access, the cost quarterly of being public has driven a decline in public companies and in the pushing up the market cap required to go public because of these overwhelming costs. So first, Mr. Elenoff, would you agree it's appropriate to expand the pool of investors and that the ideas that we have in the Fair Investment Opportunities for Professionals Act are worthwhile?
I do. I think it's right-minded.
And do you have a comment on that point, that it's really that it's more about cost of being public and some of those associated issues rather than just a more open Reg D process that's led to fewer public companies?
Overall, again...
I mean, as a general statement.
Yeah, overall, I think those are the real concerns, the costs and burdens of quarterly filings and the expenses associated with them.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Let me first ask this question to Professor Jones and Professor DeFontenay. I hope I got that right. There has been a decrease number of IPOs, is that right?
Yes.
It would be interesting, and if there are a couple more panelists that want to bounce this question around, it would be interesting for us to know, in y'all's opinion, what led to this? What were the factors? Is it healthy for us? Is it a concern? Tell us about this. Why is this happening?
I think there are a lot of reasons. Professor DeFontenay, I think, outlines just the reality that there's just a lot of money available in the private equity markets, and so entrepreneurs, when they want to raise money, there's so much money there that they don't necessarily have to tap the public markets. But importantly, there was a rule set by Congress and the SEC that said if you had 500 or more shareholders, regardless of whether you had a listing with the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, you had to provide disclosure to those investors. And that was to ensure that investors who were interested in buying or trading shares in these companies, even if they had not gone public, would have adequate information to make their investment decision. So that requirement to file and disclose on a regular basis information to investors, generally speaking, for large growing public companies, would also cause them to decide to pursue a listing so that insiders and investors could sell their shares, and also do a public offering or an IPO.
Now, do you all think this is a good thing for our economy, for our investment markets, or a bad thing?
I think it's important that investors in private company shares have some basis, some reason, some ability to know what the value of those investments are. And in the private markets, that information is not available. So there's at some point in time when a company is large enough and has a broad enough ownership base that for investors to make informed decision, there has to be some kind of public disclosure.
Oh, but is it a good thing or a bad thing? Yes or no?
It's a good thing to have more information for investors.
So this decreasing number, is it something we should worry about? Is it a good thing or a bad thing losing?
Public offerings?
Yeah.
Many people think it's a bad thing. I think, yes.
Okay, good. Well, no, they think it's a bad thing.
Many people think
Good.
that the shrinking of public markets is
Yeah.
not
Yeah,
desirable.
that's what I felt,
Okay.
so I'm in good shape. Now, let's go to fraud. The other three gentlemen here. The Securities and Exchange Commission, in its concept relief, said that it was difficult to identify fraud in the private markets. Now, why do you think this is? Why is it difficult to establish fraud?
So in our experience, the private marketplace has a significant amount of retail, of investor fraud, I should say. We see this in my state, we see this in my sister agencies across the country, that individuals go out and, in the congressman's words, fleece individual investors, and that is an opportunity because the markets are not as transparent, they're not as public, and they're not policed the same way as the public markets.
Mm-hmm. All right, I got one more minute. I'm an investor. I bought my first stock when I was 11 years old, and it is the key to wealth building, so I'm going to try to keep that as well. But let me get y'all's opinion on this other one, stock splitting, the splitting of stocks. Good thing, bad thing? To me, it's a good thing. With the role it is playing now, its impact, the splitting of stocks, and how companies use that.
I can take that. Normally, a stock split is not bad for investors. It usually means that the company has gotten so large that they actually want to divide the number of shares, say, in two, in order to have more shares circulating. So in theory, there's no problem with the stock split itself.
So you don't see any companies that have abused and misused stock splitting where it could be of some danger to the market?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right, thank you.
Okay, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I thank our guests. Appreciate your testimony and expertise in this field. And as an entrepreneur, part of the reason I came to Congress was to try to save capitalism. So hopefully we all succeed in this endeavor. One of the great things about America, we have become truly the world's land of opportunity for goods, services, capital, intellectual property. And we've done that not because we have no regulation, nor because we have massive regulation. And the trend towards massive regulation did decrease initial public offerings. And there are other factors, though, that have decreased it. And I think Congress wisely saw some of those and said, you know, we should provide an outlet for smaller capital formation. Because the only way to access publicly resourced capital in the U.S. Shouldn't be unregulated. So we created Reg A+, Reg D. Prior to me being here, Congress did these things. And I think that when you look at their effectiveness, they are helping businesses grow, form, and frankly, people create and preserve wealth, which is good for the United States of America and good for capital formation here instead of elsewhere. But while the focus of this hearing is on initial public offerings and not initial coin offerings or the tokenized economy, I'm particularly focused on the use of blockchain technology as part of capital formation. I'm concerned that if we do not get the SEC rules right on innovation taking place within the blockchain community, the United States will lack the regulatory certainty that we need for capital formation to take place here. It'll take place, as it is increasingly taking place outside the United States. And that is not good for our economy, for our investors, for our innovators, and our entrepreneurs. So my bipartisan bill, the Token Taxonomy Act, identifies circumstances in which it makes sense to define when the SEC is not the primary regulator for a capital raise. Specifically, when a token is not commonly controlled, when it is no longer able to be regulated by the SEC. And this would be clear so that the SEC knows, and then those who would put capital at risk would also know. And in that sense, we put together a roundtable over a year ago now that was initially going to be 20 people, turned into 30 people, turned into 50 people, was oversold, and we couldn't bring more people in. And it produced this bill, which is completely nonpartisan in the way that it's loaded up. And we saw that we were ahead of companies like Libra. So while we've wanted to have a hearing specific to this bill and this topic, Facebook's launch of Libra brought together the momentum publicly to have that hearing and discussion. Unfortunately, a lot of the hearing focused on Facebook as a company and not so much on the technology and the capital formation. We did have a subsequent hearing that I hope we can build on and have in the near future, something specifically where we talk about capital raise in this part of the economy and the regulatory certainty we need to make sure that as we see tokenized assets put to use in the United States, we're clear what is the regulator. And it's clear sometimes some of the companies that have done this are essentially just regulatory arbitrage. They really are securities. And the Token Taxonomy Act would make it clear. If you don't meet this test, you're a security. You have to follow the law on securities. On the other hand, there has to be a criteria that says, if you meet this, even if the SEC really, really wants to regulate you, that's not their jurisdiction, it's someone else's. And so I guess, Dr. Lowe, could you describe the importance of providing businesses options in raising capital through private offerings with a particular focus on the challenges that face areas of emerging technology like blockchain?
Well, this is exactly the challenge with a lot of the entrepreneurs that I come in contact with, particularly from my university. The technologies that were being developed are so new that it's very hard for investors to understand what's going on, and as a result, it's difficult to raise money. So any mechanism that while protecting investors, also allows young entrepreneurs to be able to get access to capital, particularly in technologies that are emerging like cryptocurrencies and blockchain, would be very welcome for innovation.
Thank you for that. And I will say, at that hearing, I had a young entrepreneur who had written code come up to me and say, "Why do Republicans protect their wealthy investors?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm writing code and I can't invest in a startup." And he thought that it was Republicans were on this. I corrected him and said, no, it's generally the other side of the aisle that likes this accredited investor rule. So I hope we can do something to allow innovative people like this young man be able to invest in the startups that they're helping to launch and create. With that, I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm here to tell you not all Democrats feel that way. The Main Street Growth Act is a bold step forward that adds a new tool in our capital acquisition tool chest. A bill creates venture exchanges dedicated to the sale of privately held securities, specifically for small and emerging companies. For the businesses, we provide access to capital, and for the investors, we offer the opportunity to invest in what could be the most profitable stage of a company's life cycle. These companies would have to meet the same rigorous standards as those listed on NASDAQ or with other exchanges. Now, obviously, we all know that with great risk, or with a great reward, comes great risk. And it's important to understand, however, that the risk is a business risk associated with the purchase of any security, and the upside potential for the stocks are proportional. It's proportional to the risk of any other investment that we normally make. The Main Street Growth recognizes the capabilities of the American people. Act puts the power in the hands of the people to make the investment choices that are right for them, and to purchase securities only offered never offered to private investors, and mostly viewed behind closed doors, and it lets private investors into some of these private meetings. My question is for Mr. Elinoff. I read your testimony a lot about liquidity and how this plays a part in venture exchange, whether you're a retail or institutional investor. Can you tell the committee more about how the venture exchange proposal would help with liquidity?
The primary purpose of the exchange is specifically to enable those that have acquired securities in an initial issuance from the issuer to be able to resell some or all of that position or investment that they've purchased to other interested investors, and to do it through an exchange, and so that's how you create the liquidity.
So how about access to stocks? Would this open up the realm of possible deals and opportunities for the average retail investor?
Assuming that the bill allows retail investors to participate, which is my understanding that it would, then yes, they would have the ability to buy stocks earlier, and it somewhat addresses the concern of only being able to buy later on.
Are there any matters we should watch out for in implementing the exchange? I want to make sure that things are done right. In this regard, do you have any advice for the committee?
It's a complicated question, and just like the Jobs Act Title III for crowdfunding, the details of such an initiative is important, and there are a lot of variables that I think we'd have to go into. The broad concept, I think, is directionally correct, particularly given the growth in the private markets, but how those exchanges operate, how they're regulated, how investors are vetted to make sure there's suitability, along with KYC and AML issues. There are a range of issues, but the structure makes sense to me, and so I'd be supportive of that sort of initiative.
Well, I welcome any future advice that you might have for us here in financial services. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good morning. I really appreciate everybody being here. During the August work period, I got the distinct honor of meeting with the CEO and general counsel of a company right there in the Hoosier State that had recently gone public. I had been following them for a long time. They truly started their business about 30, 35 years ago right there in the Hoosier State. We're excited to see the growth in that business, excited to undergo many acquisitions, many management changes, but ultimately we're able to go public last year. And though they came in to talk to me about something outside of their experience being public, I quickly turn the conversation towards that because we read a lot of research up here, a lot of white papers, a lot of PhDs that talk about how challenging it is to be public today, how many fewer public companies there are today than there were before, how many companies are going public compared to where they were before. This is really, really important work, and I know that research is deep and thoughtful, but I was interested in their anecdotal experience, and they laid it out for me and said, it is terrible. It is terrible, it is costly, it is difficult to be public today. They wanted to be public. They were excited about reaching a milestone of being public. They were excited about the permanent capital that came along with being public. But the general counsel, with a weary look in his eyes, talked about the difficulty in being public, just in their experience over the last 8 months, whether that's with some of the litigation expenses, the compliance expenses, the ongoing expenses. They estimated it to be about $10 million a year for them. That's what they had estimated beforehand. They revised that to about $12.5 million recently to say that that's the cost of being public, not to mention some of the management distractions and headaches. And look, I applaud both the majority and the minority today for some of their work in focusing on how we empower investors to get access to some of these private markets, right? It's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Did the private markets grow to be so large because of their inherent attractiveness? Or alternatively, was it the difficulties in going public, in being public, that enabled the growth in the private markets? And I think, frankly, that chicken and egg problem hasn't yet been solved. But I'm really interested in turning some of the dialogue to what it's like to be public today, the costs associated with being public today, and how we return some of that to, I guess, as they put it in that meeting, to sanity, so that they can focus on delivering a higher return on capital to their shareholders, so they can focus on running a superior business, so they can focus on serving their customers, so they can focus on empowering their employees. And Mr. Elenoff, I saw in your testimony, you very simply wrote, is the cost of being public too burdensome? ? Yes, period, is your statement. I was curious if you might expound upon that and talk about some of the challenges associated with being public. I know, look, we've passed some bills in the last Congress. We've even passed some bills in this Congress to help alleviate that. But I wondered if you might still talk about some of those issues and what we really need to focus on in Financial Services Committee to empower more companies to make this choice for the benefit of Main Street investors, for the benefit of shareholders generally, for the benefit of American enterprise, and the benefit of our liquid, deep capital markets. Long-winded question.
No, I think you framed it very, very well, and I appreciate it. The reason I was short in saying just yes is that some of those variables are outside the jurisdiction of this committee. Right. Law firms are expensive. Accounting firms are as well. I think a very good example, and I mentioned it earlier, Title I it reduced the financial statement requirements for an emerging growth company from 3 years to 2 years. Well, that's not just a tagline. That actually has real-life implications on the amount of work that a law firm has to do, as well as the accounting firm. So that's, I think, a very good example of something that Congress has done that it was worthwhile and helps small business. Right. The example that you give of the entrepreneur that you met who was interested and excited about going public and now isn't as happy about that decision is unfortunate. I think we have to do a better job collectively schooling and educating entrepreneurs about what that pathway looks like. Right. But I think a lot of the bills that are before us today address some of those issues, not the cost necessarily. And I think the Jobs Act as well, particularly Reg A+, is a very good demonstration of what Congress can do to create a lighter regulatory pathway to the public markets, even though it should be acknowledged that Reg A+ hasn't worked as well as it ought to.
Right. I think what I continue to come back to here in a lot of my legislative work and a lot of my speaking engagements is to talk about a runway. Right? We shouldn't have, if you're a public company and you got $1 million float, that's probably a different type of company than a $10 billion company. And making sure there's a runway where the regulatory burden, the compliance costs associated grow as the firm grows, either in size of revenues, in market cap, employees, whatever the case may be, whatever the right metric and dimension is, but to ensure that this is a pathway for companies to get larger, not just an immediate hit of significant costs and compliance burden. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And the gentleman from Illinois. Mr. Foster is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. In this discussion, there's been a graphic that's been going, I'm sure you've noticed, with that shows that participation in public markets has been basically flat over the last decade, whereas private markets have roughly doubled. And that strikes me as possibly being in large part simply a reflection that wealthy people have a larger wealth slice and more to invest than they used to. Household net worth, for example, also has roughly doubled since the financial crisis, with most of the wealth going to those in the top quintiles. And you can imagine a situation where most of the shift that we're seeing towards private markets is simply the fact that wealthy people have more money and they preferentially invest in private versus public placement. Are any of you familiar? Has this been studied to try to separate out that effect, to find out what fraction of the shift toward private markets is simply due to the wealth distribution in the U.S.?
So, Congressman, I think you make an excellent point, and this is a point we tried to make in our testimony and we'll reiterate here, is that there's a lack of data, there's a lack of information in the private marketplace to get down to any level of granularity, particularly the type of granularity that you're talking about. There's a couple of bills that are proposed that would add some little bit of a degree of transparency in the private marketplace and then ask for a study of that marketplace. So I think that is important to get more information, more data, so that we can answer questions like that and policymakers can make informed decisions.
Yeah, well, even just simple, very high-level data like what's the marginal propensity to invest in private versus public markets for wealthy versus non-wealthy people, then that propensity could be in a straightforward manner applied to changes in the wealth distribution. It might be that there's a whole narrative we're chasing that's actually not really what's driving this apparent shift toward the private markets. Okay, change of subject here. This has to do with Bitcoin ETFs. To date, the SEC has not yet approved a Bitcoin ETF, and the staff has registered some very significant concerns for investor protections, including in a January 2018 letter with the Director of Investment Management. This letter raises a number of issues that the staff believes should be addressed, including valuation, liquidity, custody, arbitrage, and manipulation, all of which I think are real concerns. Just to mention the last one, manipulation, there's a very excellent article recently by Tim Massad, who's been before this committee, that describes the difficulty in preventing manipulation with things like wash trades. If these things are truly anonymous or pseudonymously held, how do you even identify wash trades as one form of manipulation? However, it was recently reported that one company has been seeking approval for a Bitcoin ETF for years, VanEck, and it's decided that it can nonetheless offer this product as exempt from SEC oversight as a private offering for qualified institutional buyers using Rule 144A. And this offering would generally be exempt from registration and ongoing reporting requirements and obligations of the federal securities laws. Interestingly, by being exempt, this product would have an even greater valuation and other risks than an approved ETF offering. So despite serious concerns from the SEC, which are largely unrelated to whom the product would be offered, the company would be able to sell this product into the markets. And so I guess, Mr. Pichek, first, would this raise investor protection concerns for you?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the manipulation issue is real. I think particularly foreign manipulation, there's a lack of authority for the SEC and for state regulators to go after some of these foreign actors which would be able to manipulate the price. It's not just people in the United States. So that's a concern, as would just generally the volatility within this space.
And Ms. DeFontenay, does this raise bigger questions about the ability of would-be issuers to skirt SEC rules to offer new products?
Certainly. So they're making use of, or potentially making use of, an exemption from the securities registration rules to do something that the SEC explicitly did not want them to do. So it is an illustration of the fact that retail investors are not the only ones at risk in the private markets. There are, as we saw with mortgage-backed securities and so on, even institutional investors can be subject to manipulation or to just very risky bad deals.
Well, thank you. I think this is a very illustrative example of the sort of balances we have to strike on this committee. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
We're told that it's unfair that public companies have to live by certain rules, private companies escape those rules, private companies therefore have an advantage, become more popular. Where the rule is there to achieve an important social purpose, it is up to this committee to impose those same rules on large non-public companies. We care about the slavery and death in eastern Congo Zaire from conflict minerals and conflict diamonds, but we only impose duties on publicly traded companies. We need to impose those on large private companies as well. To fail to do so is both unfair to the public companies, though I shed few tears for the behemoths of Wall Street, but it leads to death and slavery where those minerals and diamonds are mined. So I hope that this committee will explore the idea of creating a category I would call the public company equivalent. That is to say, any private company that has a size at least equal to the average public company. To fail to do so is for us to say, we care about conflict diamonds and conflict minerals, but only a little bit. The gentleman from Ohio talked about cryptocurrencies and the Libra. This is an attempt by Facebook, this is an attempt by Mark Zuckerberg to put himself in a position where he can literally print money. That's why it should not be called the Libra, it should be called the Zuck Buck. It is shameful that an SEC dedicated to protecting investors would look at literally hundreds of billions of dollars of investment transactions in what is substantially at this stage a investment asset, an intangible investment asset, and not shut it down the way they've shut down other circumstances where people are selling unregistered investments to the public. Let's see. There is a certain fear of being left out, but keep in mind by those who are not accredited investors, qualified investors, et cetera, keep in mind for those who are qualified, they choose to put 99% of their money in something other than private equity, such as bonds. So to say that this is so great that the average American is being left out, and that's a travesty. If it was so great, those who were qualified would take full advantage of that qualification. Ms.
Fontenay, yes.
DeFonte, I wasn't here when your name was pronounced. In your written testimony, you focus on intermediate steps we could take or to benefit, to allow people to participate in private equity. For example, should we adjust the 15% illiquid securities net asset cap for mutual funds, particularly those that are target date funds offered through 401ks and similar plans? These funds know when they're going to need to need the liquidity. Why do we limit them? They're qualified, accredited, and everything else investors to only 15%.
That's a very difficult question. So I'd like to start by noting that, in fact, the most recent research, and these are really large studies of all large institutional investors in the U.S., show that the returns on the private markets and the public markets are actually converging. So as the private markets have gotten much more crowded, the sort of above-market returns have been going down and now are converging with the public markets. So the notion that the private markets are this promised land of
But is there any reason we can't modify that 15%?
Well, we could. The difficulty with mutual funds is that they promise liquidity. And so if you would have to restrict investment liquidity somewhat.
If you're in a 401k, you're not really promised that level of liquidity. There are huge taxes if you take the money out at the wrong time. And then if you invest in a 401k that is age-based, you've pretty much selected that investment to be ready for you at a particular age. Do we really need to have that high level of liquidity requirement under those circumstances?
There are certainly ways to do this, for sure. Yeah.
I want to move on. I don't know which witness to address this. There's unlisted trading privileges for very large, and I know that the bill before us, the Main Street Growth Bill, would deal with this aspect of publicly traded companies. do we need to deal with the unlisted trading provision, privileges in that bill? And would the bill as currently written undermine the opportunity to have several exchanges compete when you want to deal with a publicly traded security? Mr.
So Congressman Pichak. So Congressman, our view on this is that really the effort should not be to make the private market look more like the public market, but to incentivize the public market and to really invigorate it. So a better place to look to how to maybe address this issue would be a bill that was proposed called the Middle Market IPO Act. This was something that was looking at how to incentivize these smaller companies. We've heard a little bit about that today, to incentivize them and to understand the cost for them to go public and whether there is the ability to change that framework.
I'm going to try to squeeze in at least one more question, and this is a pretty technical one. So I understand it.
Time has expired.
Oh, it's a minute over. Yes.
You're a minute over, okay. Okay, but
I'll ask you a question for the record. Thank you.
okay, we can follow up in writing with other questions. Before we wrap up, I'd like to take care of a few administrative matters. First, I'd like to recognize the ranking member for his desire to make a submission to the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to submit for the record the opening statement of the ranking member, Mr. McHenry, who was not here at the time.
Without objection. I'd like to submit letters and statements for the record from the following organizations: Healthy Markets, Consumer Federation of America, the Angel Capital Association, the Chamber of Commerce, the Institutional Limited Partners Association, the Chicago Board Options Exchange, the National Venture Capital Association, the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council, NASDAQ, M&A Securities Group, OTC Markets Group, the Alliance of Merger and Acquisition Advisors, and 3 other groups, Public Citizen, and Congressman David Schweikert. And I'd like to thank all of the witnesses today for very spirited and informative testimony. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. And I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able to, and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous material to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is adjourned and to be continued. We had a lot of interest.